Building a family can be a complicated, messy, lonely, and sometimes heartbreaking process. But you don't have to navigate this challenging journey alone.
Welcome to the All Paths podcast, where we support and celebrate all of the different ways there are to try to grow your family. We are your hosts, Kate and Emily from the nonprofit organization All Paths Family Building. And today we're talking with author and advocate Ginanne Brownell about her journey. Ginanne, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you guys for having me. I'm really so pleased to be here talking to you both.
Well, we are so happy to have you. And before we get into your family building journey in more detail, I'd love for you to just introduce yourself for our listeners.
Sure. So I am a London-based American journalist. I'm from Michigan originally. I have been a journalist my entire career, and I have just finished my second book, or my second book is coming out, which is called Elusive Mommyhood, a investigative journalist personal journey into IVF and surrogacy. And so it details not only sort of my personal journey through what I did to become a mother, but also sort of I look at sort of surrogacy and IVF from a very broad sort of holistic, approach. So looking at everything from the history of surrogacy and, the feminist arguments for and against surrogacy to the sort of international debates around surrogacy, why people become surrogates, and how children born through surrogacy feel about it, and sort of everything in between.
So excited to read that. Very, very exciting. So yeah, where did your family building journey begin?
Sure. So I got married later in life. So I got married sort of in my mid 40s. And I had sort of, when I thought I wasn't going to get married, I decided that I wanted to be, I wanted to be a mom. And so I sort of, I had donor sperm and I got pregnant and had a miscarriage. And then I froze a bunch of eggs before I turned 40. And then I met my husband. And then we decided that we wanted to try and quickly, family build. And so we started doing, everything. We, tried the natural way, of course, and that wasn't seeming to work out. So then we started looking at doing, everything, IVF. But well, before we did that, my gynecologist, she flushed my fallopian tubes, put me through temporary menopause. I mean, all these different kinds of things to recalibrate my system. And we tried fresh IVF transfers. We tried frozen transfers, the whole 9 yards. And about 2.5 or 3 years into the whole process, my gynecologist said to me, I think we need to, accept that you have unexplained infertility. And so I actually had some friends a gay couple from Israel who were sort of doing surrogacy. And I sort of talked to them about it because I'd never met anybody before who'd done it. And it just seemed like something that was very pie in the sky, only like Silicon Valley tech billionaires or Bollywood superstars, did it. And so all of a sudden, these two people that were very dear friends of mine were doing it. And I, decided that it was just something that could be a possibility for us. And so that's proven a story, but I do now have 7-year-old twins who were born through surrogacy in Illinois. And so the story does have a happy ending, but it's a lot about sort of, it was a long process to get there.
Mm-hmm. So I know you said you're based in London now. So this was happening when you were in the UK, or were you still in the US during your journey?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've been based here for 27 years. And so when we looked at starting to do surrogacy, we looked first here in the UK because you can do surrogacy here in the UK. However, the waiting list was like 18 months. And I looked at, so they have non-compensated surrogacy here. And I just, I didn't necessarily like how the system was from what I could understand. And so because I'm American, we decided that we were going to do surrogacy in the US because it just seemed like it was, I mean, we've been, at that point I was like, 44, something like that. And so we were realizing time was of the essence. And so we decided to do surrogacy in the US. And I wanted to do it in my home state of Michigan because at the time my mom was still living in Michigan. She's now since moved. But then when we found an agency and we signed up with them, they said, you cannot do it in Michigan. And at the time, I didn't really think much about it. I was like, well, that's weird, but like, let's kind of move on this process. So in the end, we found a wonderful surrogate based in Illinois, and our children were born in Illinois. And I found out later on, sort of working on this book, that Illinois was one of the best places to do surrogacy because they have something that's even simpler than sort of a pre-birth judgment, but they have an administrative order, I think it's called. So it was super easy, before, we didn't have any complications when the kids were born. Whereas I think in some states like Colorado, for example, I think you have to do um, judgments after, the babies are born through surrogacy. So we were really lucky in that sense. But yeah, we decided to do it in the US because, it just it was a less amount of time, but also I was American. It made a lot of sense that, once the kids were born, we'd have to wait for passports and whatever. So it made sense to kind of do it in the US. And luckily, we were only a state away from Michigan. But that also brought something up that was really sort of stressful, is that at one point I was like, well, if you're not supposed to do surrogacy in Michigan because, it was a felony, are we going to get in trouble, if we bring the kids back to Michigan and they've been discovered to have been born through surrogacy? Like, what's kind of the legal? So it was a bit stressful in terms of that. So
Yeah. I mean, the legal system around fertility treatment and surrogacy is stressful under, you know, your average circumstance, not, never mind pulling in the UK legal system and trying to balance, an international birth.
yeah.
How was that whole experience like, just not only from the logistical side, but also the emotional side of being, on the other side of the world from where your babies were growing?
Well, that was sort of interesting because, Julie, our surrogate, the first time she didn't get pregnant with my frozen eggs. And then the second time she got pregnant with our last remaining genetic embryo. And at 8 weeks, she had a miscarriage. And so that was like, I was in Tanzania on a work trip. And it was sort of, I write about this in the book and how it was really, in a way, good that I was so far away, because it kind of like I had time to kind of work through, what that was all about. And then we ended up having to use a donor. And so there was a lot of sort of emotions just once we already had our surrogate. But I think, there were sort of, also when Julie found out that she was pregnant with our twins, we'd had a house fire, like not, recently. It happened like, right around the time we found out she was pregnant. And so in a way, I had so much to worry about dealing with my house that I didn't have the time to sort of, be really stressed about the pregnancy, which was probably very good, because having been so much involved in that process for such a long time, maybe in some ways better that I wasn't there, because I could kind of had to let her get on with things and I had to get on with things. The one thing that was sort of stressful was, so there are obviously lots of different different countries have different rules around surrogacy. So in the US, my children got citizenship because they were born in the US, and also I'm a US citizen, and the 14th Amendment, children born in the US are US citizens for now. And in the UK, and other countries, they adhere to something called Mater semper certa est, which is a Roman law principle, meaning the mother is always certain. So before 1986, when the first child was born through gestational surrogacy in the world in Michigan, that was the case, that whoever gave birth to the child was obviously the mother, because that was her, genetic material, her egg that was used to give birth in a traditional surrogacy. In 1986, when this first child was born in Michigan through gestational surrogacy, which is when the surrogate is not genetically related to the child, that meant that, the parents, the intended parents could be put on the birth certificate. But in the UK, they look at whoever physically gives birth to the child is the parent until you go through something here called a parental order. And so you have to sort of do everything from, we had to go to court twice. We had to have somebody from this organization called COFCOS, which is the social services agency, come through and interview us and make sure that we were like good parents to our children, and sort of do this whole thing. And it was really dumb, in my opinion, because I kept saying to my barrister when we were going through this process, like, so Julie and Chad, our surrogate and her husband, live in Illinois. They have no plans of moving here, but if they did move to the UK, then technically they would be the parents of our children, but they couldn't legally live in the UK. Like, it was just weird, because I'm like, the minute we went back to the US, they'd be our children again. And my barrister was like, yeah, it's really dumb, but it's the process that you have to do. And the reason why we did it, but nobody would have known that they weren't our kids, except that because they were donor conceived, my barrister said, if you were to ever get divorced, which we did in the end, your husband could argue that they're not genetically your children, and it could be a whole thing. So we did it as a process for them to get their British birth certificates, to then get their passport. So that's a long, complicated answer, but so that was really interesting, is different jurisdictions look at surrogacy in different ways. And it was, And the UK is looking to change that, but it's so, it's sort of wherever you live, in some states in the US, it's easy. In some states, it's not. In some countries like the UK, they recognize surrogacy, but in countries like Spain or Germany, they don't recognize surrogacy. So it's a very mixed bag of surrogacy globally. And that was I wrote about a lot in the book because I thought it was fascinating. Just like, yeah,
Mhm.
depending on where you live, you have different things that, can make you not necessarily viewed as the parent of your own child through surrogacy.
Well, speaking of that, so to learn that your own home state, where I feel like even when you're not living in it, you have a affection for your home state that doesn't go away. What was it like to hear that that was one of the only states still in the United States where surrogacy was not legal?
Well, it was interesting. So, first of all, when we started working with Circle, which was the agency that we, worked with in terms of our surrogacy, they had said, as I said earlier, that they didn't explain it at the time. They just said you can't do it. And then when we were doing our contract with our surrogate, who, funny enough, she was originally born in Michigan, it said in the contract that I think after her first trimester, she was not allowed to travel to the state of Michigan. So I was like, whoa, that's super weird. And then later on, working on this book, that's when I kind of discovered. So the reason is that in 1976, the first surrogacy contract in the world was signed in Michigan. And then 10 years later, the first child, as I said earlier, born through gestational surrogacy, was born in Michigan as well. And that was because there was a lawyer named Noel Keene who sort of created all these surrogacy contracts. And he's also the same lawyer that created the contract for the very famous, or infamous, I should say, Baby M case that happened in New Jersey in sort of the mid 80s. And so the Michigan, legislature was very concerned about, after Baby M, it freaked everybody out. And so the state of Michigan decided that they wanted to stop this happening because they didn't want to have any other, cases like this. And so they created the surrogate parenting law, which made it so that compensated surrogacy and surrogacy contracts became a felony. So that's sort of where the state of Michigan, and so that's where we were until this new law, which came into effect last year, which I can talk more about in a minute.
So how did you go from learning this about Michigan to later becoming an advocate, in and with your home state?
So when I was working on the book and I was, learning about the history of surrogacy, which I found super fascinating. And again, I didn't have any idea that that was at all connected to Michigan. It was just like I was like, wait, what? Like I was blown away when I first heard like how important, what a role my state played in sort of the global surrogacy, the history of global surrogacy. And I met two women who do a podcast, and they had interviewed this woman called Stephanie Jones, who was from Michigan. And they said, oh, you really should meet with Stephanie to talk about sort of what's happening now. And so I got in contact with Stephanie, and turns out we're from the same town. And so it was like automatically, we're like, oh my gosh, do you know so, that kind of, thing that you do when you meet somebody. And we had people in common, whatever. And we both are very sort of type A, probably have ADHD, both very much like we joke now that we work from the same brain. And we just both really connected. She founded the Michigan Fertility Alliance after almost dying for the second time from an ectopic pregnancy. She'd had two and almost died both times. And she founded MFA from her hospital bed. And she wanted to, change because she changed the law. And we just started talking a lot, just in general. I was sort of geeking out on all the things that I learned about, surrogacy. And she was telling me sort of what she was hoping to do with MFA. And finally, about like 6 months in, after talking a couple times a day, just, chatting about like we, nerded out all the time on surrogacy. She's like, would you want to come on board and, help do some communications and research for me? And I was like, yes. And I never kind of set out to be an advocate or an activist, but it was something that I was so passionate about. And she was so passionate about. And I think that because, it was like this perfect storm because we got along so well. And we were like, let's change the law. And like we kind of joked about it, like, ha ha ha, but we were also determined to do it. And I think knowing now, we would still done it, but like, I mean, it was, a long process, but we really, I mean, we were in the trenches. Yeah. We always say we're each other's ride or die when it comes to sort of fertility healthcare work. So that's kind of how, I went from, and I'm still a journalist and I still, whatever, but I also very much feel that my sort of advocate hat is just as important. And I'm really passionate about that just as much as I have been, even though, we were able to do the work that we did in Michigan with our law.
Yeah, and for those that don't know, you did pass the law, ha ha ha.
We sure did. We did. We worked, it was about 4 years we worked on. I mean, we were lucky. I mean, the story is that, in 2022, right after the election, and this was when Prop 3 was passed in Michigan, so that codified abortion care in Michigan. And for the first time in 40 years, the Michigan legislature was Democratic, or it was, a Democrat majority in the House and the Senate, plus Governor Whitmer, who is also a Democrat. And so it was like the time was nigh. And so one of my contacts, Carla Torres from the Center for Reproductive Rights, reached out to us and said, hey, after all this like great stuff that happened with Prop 3 and like what's happened politically with the legislature, I feel like that it's time to go for it. They helped craft a coalition of wonderful national experts who work on parentage law, surrogacy and fertility healthcare law. And we worked on crafting this bill. And it was it was really interesting to I've always covered politics, but I've never been in the midst of it. So being on the other side was really interesting. And at times slightly mind numbing, but we diligently worked on all these different aspects. And we also, what was the most important thing that at the time we didn't think about, but now I realize this is really an important aspect of the bill. It's not just a surrogacy law that now allows for contracts for surrogacy and compensation for surrogates, but it also allows that children born through assisted reproduction in Michigan will never have to worry about, who their parents are, because from birth, children will know who their parents are. So for example, if you have a single sex, if you have a lesbian couple, right? And like, so the mother who gives birth to the child, if she's the genetic mother, obviously her name goes on the birth certificate. But before this, you would have to do, a second parent adoption. And it was just like a very long process. Whereas now they can do it's an adoption. I can't remember what the term is. I always
Voluntary
forget.
acknowledgement of parentage.
Yes, exactly. Thank you very much. Yes. Now that happens. And so by the time, the child comes home from the hospital, that's their parents and there's no question. And so when Stephanie and I work on it, we're two heterosexual women. We were just looking at it from the surrogacy lens and working with groups like GLAAD and the National Center for Lesbian Rights and Family Equality. They kind of were like, well, if we're going to do this bill, let's make it as broad as we can for all children. And I think that in a weird way is like, I'm equally proud of everything with the bill, but in a way I'm super proud about that too, because it was something that we didn't have experience in, but we became very passionate about that too.
Yeah, and that's just another power of coalitions moment is like we all bring different perspectives and strengths to this effort. That's why, we always say like advocacy should be a team sport because you're a better advocate when you're working together. So,
100%.
well, thank you for sharing all that. It's exciting to share happy news like a victorious bill.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And, but, the one slight thing that, was depressing in a sense is that no Republicans in the House voted for our bill, and only two senators who were Republican voted to pass the bill in the Senate. And so Michigan has a quirk. I don't know if other states do, but if a bill doesn't pass by 2/3 majority in the Senate, then you have to wait 90 days after the end of the legislative session. And so our bill was signed on April 1st, 2024. Our bill won't actually go into effect until April 1st, 2025. And I think what makes me very angry is that, especially in this last election, you had, everybody from both sides talking about, oh, we love IVF, we're all for fertility healthcare, whatever. Well, the voting records of those Republicans on the record showed that they were not supporting a bill that was related to IVF and infertility. So, I mean, that's why there are families in Michigan who've had to wait a year before they can start their families through surrogacy. And I think that is really disturbing. I mean, luckily, we've only got, 2 months before this bill, finally takes effect, but it really made us angry too, because it's like, well, you can't sit there on one side of the fence and say, oh, we love IVF, but then you're not supporting a bill that actually helps, families grow, because we've had to wait literally a year for the bill to finally take effect.
It is very frustrating when people's words and actions do not match at all.
Yes, yes.
So what inspired you to turn your own personal experience and your work as an advocate into a book?
Well, there were sort of two reasons. One was it was right around the time of COVID, and I was kind of looking for a project. I'd finished one book that was totally unrelated to anything to do with surrogacy. It was about international development in Kenya. And then I sort of thought, well, a friend of mine was saying, well, you really should write about surrogacy. And I was like, I don't want to write my story because, like, there are a lot of stories out there about people who've gone through what I've gone through. And my story is, unique to me, but is it really something that, somebody's going to want to read about? But then I sort of thought, well, but I'm also a journalist and maybe I can marry these two. And I remember being very frustrated when we were going through surrogacy because there were books that we found that were either people's personal stories or how-to guides or sort of academic meanderings about like really deep in the weeds, like laws, in sort of like Indonesia and Mexico. There was nothing that was kind of a broad, spectrum of everything that was happening in the surrogacy space. And so I thought, like, as a journalist, I thought that's where I can use my skills. And it felt like there was just this missing piece in like the sort of surrogacy story out there. And so I thought, well, I'm going to use my sort of toolbox as a journalist and try and sort of do this. And I joke with people, but a lot of my friends who read the book, they're like, oh my goodness, we loved your personal story so much. It was so great. And I was like, well, actually, like, that's not what I'm excited about. I'm excited about the journal because I interviewed over 100 people. I spoke to the first person that was ever born through gestational surrogacy. I found her. I spoke to the doctor who was the first doctor to work on this. I spoke to the first judge that ever in the world ruled, again, this was in Michigan, that the intended parents and not the surrogate's name should be on the birth certificate. So it was like the journalism for me was like really inspiring. And that's what I'm most proud of in this book. Whereas everybody else, like my friends are like, we love the story about blah, which is great. I love that they appreciate that. But that to me is not, that's just my story. It's not even that interesting. It's the journalism that I'm very proud of in this book.
I think makes sense. It's your story, so you're kind of like born by it. You lived it. But as we've learned from this podcast already, it's just people they love both. I mean, it sounds so compelling what you're talking about in terms of the broader picture around surrogacy. But I would say that the heart of this podcast are people's individual stories. And we're finding people love hearing them. It takes that more abstract concept of the different paths there are to parenthood and gives like real life to it. And it's actually very comforting and interesting to listen to and hear. So, we're recording this right now in early February. And so you just had your book launch. So I was curious how that went. Does it feel like, kind of this like unveiling to the world of this something you've worked so hard for?
Yeah, I mean, it was really lovely. A friend of mine who lives in Washington, D.C., said I'd be more than happy to have, a book launch for you. And my mom lives there. And so it sort of made a lot of sense to do that. And it was an amazing time to sort of put it out into the world. And we had this, long Q&A. And it was really interesting because as a journalist, I'm used to asking the questions. I find it difficult to answer questions. And so I felt like a little bit like, oh, this is really difficult. But, the Q&A went on for quite a while and I felt like people were actually really interested. And I took away from that people don't know a lot about surrogacy and they find it fascinating. And so when you actually have somebody who can talk about it and talk about it with knowledge, I think it's very intriguing to people. And so I felt like a lot of people walked away with a broader notion. And, as we were talking a little bit earlier, there's a story right now where Lily Collins, the actress, and her husband announced that they had their first child through surrogacy. And, just there was a lot of backlash on Instagram, people, and you read these things and you sort of, I mean, I, in the end, actually replied to her husband's comment where he made a really lovely comment, essentially saying, look, this is why we did it, or not, didn't explain why they did it, but say, surrogacy, a lot of people do it for different reasons. And essentially, this is why we did it. And, bugger off, essentially. And I sort of replied back and said, great. I think you're right. Like, it's important to have these conversations around it. So I think that when you have celebrities like, Lily Collins and others, I mean, Naomi Campbell finally admitted, that her kids were born through surrogacy and other people, this is the time to sort of talk about these things because I think so little is known about surrogacy. And we, as I said, you have these stereotypes of, who does surrogacy and who surrogates are. And it's my opportunity to blow those hopefully out of the water. And again, when you talk about surrogacy, I think it's always important to say, it's a really broad reference, right? Like it's like what happens in one place is very different from what happens somewhere else, right? So what happens in California or Illinois is very different to what happens in India or in Colombia. And so I just think that, it's something that, instead of generally thinking you can speak about surrogacy. It's the nuance, as we know with anything with, fertility healthcare is. It's, these important little differences that are, really key to understanding how these things work.
Absolutely. So we've worn a number of hats over the years and had a lot of different experiences. What aspects of your work do you find most rewarding right now? Is it the advocacy? Is it sharing your story and kind of the broader story of surrogacy?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, I think because it is sort of two hats, and I sort of feel it's weird when I'm doing interviews because I'm like wearing the journalist hat now, and now I'm wearing the mom hat, and now I'm wearing the advocate hat. But I mean, one of the things that I was saying to somebody recently in an interview, and I think is really important, is that, I think one of the things that gets lost in the conversation around surrogacy is that people forget that it's actually about children, right? Like we need to reframe it. So instead of all these people, going like, oh my gosh, it's this and it's that and the other, people who, maybe aren't really well versed on surrogacy. Instead, we need to look at the fact that this is about children, right? And this is, I mean, nowadays there are probably, I would estimate upwards of hundreds of thousands of children who are born through surrogacy across the globe. And what we need to start doing is start talking to those kids and asking them, how do you feel about it? And I know for me, I wrote this book also because I didn't want my children to ever feel that there was anything shameful or quirky or weird about how they were born. And there was the only longitudinal study in the world that's been done on surrogacy was done here in the UK. And it was a researcher and her colleagues from the University of Cambridge, so a very legitimate, institution, who spent 20 years following, I think it's 41 families through surrogacy. Most of those surrogacies were traditional surrogacy, but surrogacy nonetheless. And really what she found in the end, and I have a chapter that's entitled this, like, the kids are all right, so you have children who, and it's the only study. And so I think it's very important to kind of look at it from that perspective. And, the kids who were in this study, they had two ways of, viewing what the surrogacy was about. Now they're all like around 21, 22 years old. And throughout their childhood, like as they learned more and more about it, like I think at the age of 14, when they interviewed them, the kids were like, yeah, whatever. Like either who cares how he was brought into this world? Like it's not that interesting. Like why is that even of, something we're talking about? Like I'm really into tennis. Why don't you ask me about my tennis game? Or it was like this kind of thing of like, hey, here's like a kind of quirky little thing about me. And like, this is a great, sort of, starter at a party to be like, here's something. So it was like the kids were like, cool with it. And I think that that is one of the things that I'm really trying to get out when I talk about this book is that we need to remember it's about kids, and these kids are coming of age. A lot more of them are coming of age, and they need to start talking about, and people need to start talking to them and ask them about it, because we need to stop acting as if they're sort of these babies sitting in cradles. Like a lot of them have opinions, and I've spoke to a lot of children born through surrogacy for my book, and that's sort of, I think, where the conversation has been lacking, and this is where we need to be refocusing a lot of the conversation.
I love that. So, speaking of your book and your work, if someone wanted to get in touch or to check out the book, where could they find you?
Thank you for asking that question. I have an Instagram account, elusive.mommyhood. People can buy my book on Amazon. They can buy it on bookshop.org, which supports independent bookstores across the US and the UK. Also Barnes and Noble. And so those are sort of where you can kind of get the book. It comes out February 27th. And I'm really excited for it to be out there in the world because I think it's an important topic, and especially, what's happening in the US right now with all these conversations around fertility healthcare. I feel like it hopefully will be a reference and a source for people to really look at this topic in a much more nuanced and deeper way. I hope.
That's great. Well, we will share some of this info in the show notes when your episode airs, and it'll be great for people to stay in touch with you.
So, before we wrap up, Ginanne, there are two questions that we like to ask all our guests, and we'd love to get your thoughts on them. So, the first question is, what is one thing that you would say to someone who is just starting their journey to grow their family? And the flip side is, what is one thing that you wish people would stop saying when someone tells them that they are struggling to build a family?
There's so many, I could talk about this for hours. I would say that if you're thinking about doing surrogacy, I think that it's important to look at, investigate, and really research what you're doing. If you decide to do it in the US, look at the laws in your state, and also, get to know your surrogate. I mean, I'm a big proponent of sort of ethical, inclusive surrogacy. So the idea is that for me, I wanted to have a relationship with my surrogate, and I wanted her to sort of, I wanted to sort of figure out how this relationship was going to go, and not me saying I want this relationship to be like this. Like we kind of, so I think it's really important in terms of, research around where you're going to be doing surrogacy, getting to know your surrogate. I know it's expensive, and this is one of the biggest issues with surrogacy is the issue around equity, right? And one of the reasons why surrogacy is expensive is because you have lawyers on both sides representing the surrogate and the intended parents. And while that's expensive, it's so vital that you have a contract where, your surrogate is equally represented just like you are. I think, feeling that your surrogate has agency, understanding what their motives are, I think is really important. I think if you do it abroad, I mean, I spoke to people who did surrogacy in places like Ukraine and Georgia and India. And to be honest with you, I was very shocked that some people chose to do it in those countries and not sort of know who their surrogates were. And part of that was driven by the agency. So I think really do the research, really make sure that, you understand how the laws are where you're doing surrogacy. A lot of people who do cross-border surrogacy didn't know about the laws in different countries, and that was a problem. So I think that's sort of something I would just do your research. And in terms of what was the second part of the question?
Things you don't want people to ever say again.
Okay, well, I'll tell you my number one, well, two things. The first is I hate the term, and I have been known to reach out to journalists when they use this term, is the term surrogate mother. So people oftentimes in articles will say, and the surrogate mother, blah, blah, blah. And it drives me and everybody in the surrogacy space nuts because who is the mother of a child, right? A surrogate will tell you that because in the US, at least, to be a surrogate, you have to have had a live birth and to have mothered a child. And surrogates know more than anybody that to be a mother isn't just giving birth, it's about being the person at the tennis match when your child, hits an amazing, forehand that you clap, or, you're there when your child comes home and is crying because they were, I mean, we all know what a mother is, right? And also, so they understand that, and it's offensive to them to be called the mothers of children that they, those aren't their children. And for women like me, for moms who were mothers through surrogacy, it sort of seems that term almost takes away from who I am. Like I'm the mom, and I hate that term surrogate mother. So I say to anybody out there, please don't use that. They're surrogates. You can call them gestational carriers. That's it. The other thing that bothers me too is there's oftentimes this thing about like, well, if you can't have kids, why don't you adopt? And that to me is also really offensive because I can say personally, I spent a month doing volunteer work in a state care home in Russia back in the early 2000s. And I learned from that experience that, while, I think adoption is incredible and wonderful and whatever, I didn't necessarily feel like I had the tools to be a mother who would be very good, if I adopted. A lot of people are, but I just didn't think that that was something that I necessarily, and also it shouldn't have to be that like if you can't have a child, the only other option is adoption. And I think I think people say that and they mean well sometimes when you're going through these battles and struggles. But I think that that's also, while adoption is wonderful, it's not the path for everybody. And people also forget that, for example, if you're older, right, and some states and some countries, if you and your partner, let's say, are 40, you're both 40. In some countries, if your ages add up to 80 or more, you're not allowed to adopt. So oftentimes by the time people have figured out, they can't have children, they can't, pursue fertility, infertility treatment or, fertility healthcare, they're too late for the adoption process as well. So I think I think those are the two things. Don't say surrogate mother, and don't tell somebody who's struggling, oh, you can just adopt, because it's so much more complex than that.
100%. So, before we close, is there anything that you would want to share that we haven't asked about?
I just, I will say one of the things that sort of popped up last week at my book talk, and something I'm really kind of passionate about, and Kate and I have definitely bonded on this, is that I think that grassroots advocacy is so important, and especially right now. I think that one of the things that I learned it's like, when you see somebody who wins an Oscar and they'll say when they're standing up, they're holding their beautiful, golden statuette. And they're like, when I was growing up, watching the Academy Awards, I thought I'd never win an Oscar. And here I am standing on this stage. And I think it's the same thing. Like people think like, oh, I can't get involved in politics and advocacy because like, I can't change the law. I'm just one person. And it's like, well, no, actually, and I'm not saying that our path to change the law was easy. It certainly wasn't, but I think it's really important that we all can make change. And if it's within our, small community, or if it's, in a larger state, or even, when it comes to national changes, it's just getting involved. And if you're passionate about something and you feel like you have something that can, if you feel like change can be made, people can create change. And I think that that's really important. And I think right now, especially in the US particularly, a lot of things are going to be thrown back to the states. And so, get involved. Grassroots is so important. Find great people, to work with, ask, be open-minded. And that would be what I'd say is like really my big takeaway from this book was that, I really am a strong, firm believer that if you're passionate about change, it's everybody can somehow have a little piece of that and make a difference. I really, truly, firmly believe that.
That was beautifully said.
Thank you so much, Ginanne, for talking with us today, and congrats on the law in Michigan and the upcoming book. It's super exciting. We love that you took some time out of your very busy schedule to come chat with us about everything.
Awesome. Well, thank you both very much. And thank you for highlighting, something that I think is very important. I think the more people talk about it and the more people explain this, I think hopefully we'll start to slowly change or at least, give people more to understand about this. Then it's not a simple thing. And so I appreciate, you both taking the time to talk to me about this. So thank you.
Thank you.
We hope you'll join us next time for more family building stories and resources. Be sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts to make sure you never miss an episode. And follow us on social media at allpathsfb or visit our website, allpathsfb.org, for more information about our work. All Paths Family Building is so grateful to the members of our circle of support who are vital to our ability to provide emotional support, education, and advocacy that is open to anyone struggling to grow their families. Today, we want to give a special shout out to our gold sponsor, Mass General Brigham. Thank you for joining us for this episode. Please help spread the word so that anyone who is struggling to grow their family can join the conversation. It's an honor to walk with you on your family building journey.